Welcome everyone to the book launch for Being Present, Emerging Ethnographic Perspectives and the Study of Laos. I'm Gerald Jackson, a consultant publisher at NUS Press, and I'll be in conversation today with its editors, Rosalie Stolz and Paul David Lutz, and 5 of its contributing authors. Today's session is co-hosted by the University of Cologne's Global South Studies Centre. It is a pleasure to be with you. We're broadcasting live on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. My Copenhagen living room is a small NUS outpost. We'll take questions from the audience if you join us via any of these channels. Type your questions in the chat and we'll bring them on screen for our authors to answer. If you're addressing your questions to a specific author, please add their name. Before we begin, let me add a small backstory. Prior to coming to NUS Press, for over 30 years, I headed the publication program at the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies in Copenhagen. During that time, we published many books on Laos, a few of them behind me. Some of them have become classic works. One of the last NUS Press books published on Laos was Rosalie's first monograph. Here. This was a triumph despite the challenges that the COVID lockdown presented us with. A year later, we published From Tribalism to Nationalism, a volume that focused on the anthropological turn in Laos and the contribution of Grant Evans. Taking inspiration from that book, Rosalie came to me suggesting a volume on how the most recent cohort of Laos researchers was bringing new anthropological perspectives to their various fields. Write it, I replied. And here we are. Now, there's a longer story behind this, but essentially, the book idea took flight after Rosalie joined forces with David, and they recruited their wonderful authors. With NUS closing, they came to NUS Press, also strong on Laos studies, and now home to most NUS titles. It has been a privilege to work with Rosalie and David, turning the book's early promise into an important volume with ethnographic insights far beyond Laos. And that's the backstory. There might be time afterwards for us to go more into the high idea of bringing a book into the world. But right now, let me introduce to you the editors of Being Present. They will be followed by 5 of the contributing authors outlining their chapters. Rosalie Stolz is a postdoctoral researcher at the Global South Studies Centre, University of Cologne. Her current research focuses on house transformations in mainland Southeast Asia and beyond. Paul David Lutz is an anthropologist and former rural development advisor with a long-standing focus on Laos. Currently, he is an FNRS postdoctoral researcher at the LAMC at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. Rosalie, over to you.
Ah, thank you so much, Gerald. Wow, that was overly flattering. So let me just briefly reciprocate. So David and me, we are both impressed by the fact that Gerald took the spontaneously developed idea of a volume on emerging ethnographic perspectives on Laos seriously, which I think can't be taken for granted. Yeah, and also David did not reject my request to embark with me on this editorial trip, which I hope he still does not regret too much. We mobilized our networks of colleagues who likewise did their PhD research in the 2010s, and we are delighted that those who finally became contributors shared our enthusiasm very much. And they showed also during the long process a large degree of patience, which we are truly grateful for. We could engage with all contributors, either in person, for instance, during a panel at the Euroseas conference in Amsterdam in 24, or in a series of online workshops in early 25. Being present is not only a book to us, in fact, it's the result of months and years of cooperation, the product of support by many colleagues. For instance, at NUS Press, we would like to thank sincerely Peter Schoppert, Gerald Jackson, and Lena Kwa for their support and guidance in realizing this book project. And for this book launch and promotion, we would like to thank Upasana Suresh at NUS Press and at the GSSC, Noah Kahindi and Anton Mertens. This book project, luckily, continues to bring us together, like today, those of us who share lively memories of and future plans for research in and on Laos. And now I'd like to give the floor over to David, who's going to say a little bit more about the title, for instance, of this book.
Cheers. Thank you, Rosalie. And to your question about regret, the answer is no, I can happily say. So yeah, as you see, Being Present features 10 ethnographically grounded chapters on timely issues relevant not only to Laos, but also to other developmentalist contexts in Southeast Asia and beyond. Split into 3 sections, these chapters touch on issues including agrarian transition, ethics, effect, the Belt and Road Initiative, global China's rise, mobilities, infrastructure and hydropower, healing, ritual, and the integration of minorities into nation states. All chapters are written by early career researchers drawing on their initial PhD fieldwork. And as Gerald mentioned, shortly we'll be having 5 contributors present their chapters. By way of introduction, I want to say just a few things about Rosalie and my's editorial framing effort. So in addition to the chapters offering new perspectives on substantive issues, one of the things Rosalie and I hope to do with this volume is to invite reflection on the practice and writing of ethnography today in Laos and elsewhere. And as you would have noted, the title Being Present can mean at least 2 things. In one sense, presence, so being there in the field. The field here understood not simply as a place, but as the set of interpersonal relationships, perhaps even more than human relationships, that we as ethnographers seek to immerse ourselves in. And these relationships can be tied as much to time and agency as to space itself. The second sense, of course, of being present is being in and of the present, of the here and now, in step with the times, if you will. And one of the key questions that we distilled from the contributions as they came in was, what does being present in the field mean and call for at present? In this day and age where we live in an ever more interconnected world in which contests over power and narrative are hardening, shifting, and in many cases narrowing. So I'm sure you all saw some Lego AI music videos in recent weeks. So if you want, in terms of the general spirit and zeitgeist that we're speaking of, that would be one example. And as we allude to in the volume's introduction, and as Liana Chua and Sophie Chow describe in their excellent fore and afterwards, and a big thank you to both again here, within this broader societal context, academia is seeing, again, a heightened politics surrounding ethnographic representation. And maybe this is another sense in which we can speak of being present, right? This idea of being presented and what that entails. And indeed, as many of us have experienced and facilitated, not least by open access, translation apps, and social media, our ethnographic gazes are being increasingly scrutinized and returned by those that we study. Concomitantly, anthropologists and others are emphasizing not just the self-reflexive, but also the transitive, intersubjective aspects of fieldwork, highlighting how ethnographers and their interlocutors or companions affect each other. So we as ethnographers, are not only active agents shaping events, behaviors, and narratives, as the critical turn of the 1980s emphasized, we are also objects, recipients, and foils for their, as it were, aspirations, envy, suspicions, ridicule, or whatever else it may be. And certainly in my case, and as I describe in my contribution to the volume, I was very much the subject of a strange mix of ridicule and envy for my ineptitude as a Swidden farmer. So it's not only what we make of them, but also what they make of us. And here we suggest that the initial fieldwork experience may be particularly transformative for both parties, not least because PhD fieldwork is often where one can take one's time in ways that one may never again have in an academic career. And I remember as a PhD student, I found that thought strange because I was already very much in a hustle, but senior colleagues told me, use this time you have. You might not, certainly for fieldwork, have that same amount of time. And I can say that has so far at least come to pass. And we also found that in the field, global power gaps may matter less than is often assumed. So in the daily grind of being present, people throughout Laos encountered us in various ways, as apprentices, as was the case for Elizabeth Elliott or Giulio Ongaro, as travel companions in Phill Wilcox's case, as confidants in Floramante Ponce's case, or indeed as kin, as in Rosalie's case. But of course, the transformative paths charted by ethnographic fieldwork are not yet two-way streets. Global gulfs of power do still matter and very much shape engagements between fieldworkers and hosts, certainly so between developing countries like Laos and the places where most of us come from and or work. For instance, and as I've recently experienced, Laos scholars seeking to work at Western institutions still face challenges, for example, in obtaining visas. And I could only imagine that this would be a lot more forbidding for many others that we work with, including the people in our field sites. So I sometimes fantasize what it would be like for people from my PhD, my quote unquote PhD field site in the uplands of northern Laos to come visit me in Europe or Australia or wherever it may be. And I assume that there would be a lot of hurdles involved. I haven't tested yet, but maybe. So this all, of course, contrasts with our access to Laos, its availability to us, as it were, as a laboratory, quote unquote, and vehicle for our inquiries, personal transformations, and indeed our careers. So in short, while in many ways we are growing closer together, in other crucial ways we are still very much apart, to paraphrase the title of Phill Wilcox's chapter. So to tie a ribbon around this, I think in addition to providing new ethnographic insights on contemporary Laos, which is, to be sure, the main aim of this volume and an endeavor that Rosalie and I certainly think is worthy in and of itself, we also hope that being present will stimulate reflections on issues like the ones I've mentioned and others, and thus stimulate reflection on what an efficacious ethnography, to borrow a term from Sophie Chow's afterword, might look like today. So forward-looking, conscious of, but not simply resigned to, the broader conditions in which ethnography is invariably entangled, and, to paraphrase from Liana Chua's foreword, with a refreshing openness about the relative lack of agency, control, clarity, and heroism often involved in being present in Laos and indeed wherever fieldwork is done. And I'll pass back to you, Rosalie.
Thank you. Well, now the book world is not short of great edited collections on Laos, we must say, most recently including, for instance, the Handbook of Contemporary Laos, edited by Simon Creek, Holly High, and Oliver Tapper. Well, what is specific to this volume being present is not only the fact that we feature research exclusively by early and mid-career researchers, but that this volume attempts to explicitly discuss how our being co-present, that David is talking about impacts the ways in which we learn about the field, and to include this also in our writing. And this is, well, as you will know, not an entirely new idea in ethnography, and also not entirely foreign to the ethnography of Laos. So please have a look at the volume's introduction, where you can find also references to reflexive approaches in the writing on Laos. Yet we still felt the urge to more deliberately emphasize the importance of reflexive approaches in writing that don't shy away from including the intersubjective, the embodied, the affective, and you could say all those ephemeral aspects of fieldwork that we too easily discard from our writing. Some stories simply can't be fully understood unless we know their ethnographic backstage, to refer to Pierre Petit. This backstage of ethnography may include all these coincidences and affective entanglements that have co-shaped our feedback processes, whether we were aware of it or not. Reflexive writing, thus, we suggest in this volume, can help us to enrich the study of Laos by making visible otherwise hidden or at least neglected aspects of ethnographic phenomena. And here, let me please give you some examples for this from the contributions to this volume that will be not represented during this virtual book discussion. And let me do this, I regret, in an all too short spotlight manner. Being present in the flesh, as David writes, and using embodied empathy as an instrument of knowing in his fieldwork among Gamu villages in Phongsali province, he illuminates rarely portrayed dimensions of poverty. He engaged in fieldwork literally, attempting to join in the daily agricultural work. Feeling the drudge, learning the skills, and observing the changes this brings to his body and mind, he traced and tuned into local understandings of poverty and set them in relation to official narratives of Kwamtugnak. Chips, so Charles Zuckerman's chapter, takes us to a funeral wake in Luang Prabang in order to illuminate the philosophical, rather we could say abstract problem of ethical evaluation. By following the interlocutor's interaction in words and deeds in meticulous detail and reflecting upon his sense of puzzlement, Chip casts a reflexive and lively picture of the ethics of interaction at play. In my contribution, I have, not without some embarrassment, written about how the emergence of unsettling feelings of embarrassment during my earlier PhD research made me aware of the role that, well, embarrassment, feelings of shyness play in kinship dynamics among my Gamu-Yuan interlocutors. And indeed, it were these feelings of embarrassment that pointed me to this affective dimension of kinship that I was only abstractly and really insufficiently aware of beforehand. Being present in the field as a local outsider is reflected upon by Ki, Thipapon Sayavong. Though born and raised in Laos and thus local enough from the outside, he was not seen and also did not regard himself as local in the Shu community in southern Laos, in which he investigated the changing role of rituals and notions of good health. Sometimes mistaken for a convirt or even a Falang, his Paksé accent made him identifiable as a fellow southerner. More than this, his affiliation with health institutions was of some reflexive concern to him. Did this association impact the ways in which locals were to raise matters related to ritual and cosmological beliefs that could be regarded as superstitious? Though in all these cases I just mentioned, reflective approaches appear to lend themselves for application, also the topic of infrastructure that's usually surrounded by an air of technicality, objectivity, or well, detachment can profit from this, as Jessica Di Carlo's contribution highlights. She cycled more than 800 kilometers to gain, as she says, visceral understanding of the ways in which the Laos-China economic corridor is experienced on the ground. So these were just a few examples that I hope make you curious to learn more about these case studies. But let us today now turn to the contributors present and their lessons from being present in contemporary Laos.
Thank you, Rosalie. David, you raise excellent points, which I hope will come up in the Q&A. Okay, first up among our presenters is Sumiya Bilegsaikhan Taish. And sorry, Sumiya, if I have mangled your name. She is a geographer and NUS alumni with interests in the social and cultural dimensions of environmental change and resource development. Sumiya, it's all yours.
Thanks, Gerald, and Rosalie and David and everyone else joining us today. Good evening and good morning, good day, depending on where you're joining in from. And thank you for joining us for the book launch. My name is Sumiya, and I will take the next few minutes to provide a sense of my contribution to the volume titled The Politics of Dammed Rivers and Their Futures in Northern Laos, addresses in terms of its main focus, but also the book's central theme on what it means to be present while conducting ethnographic research in Laos. This chapter emerged as a side note in a tiny section of in my PhD monograph, but then gradually emerged as a response to the way dam rivers were being discussed in the country, in Laos, as well as the broader Mekong region. We researchers, policy planners, and advocates as well are used to talking about and seeing large dams as engines of progress, symbols of modernity, or on the other hand, announced as sites of ecological ruin and livelihood loss. And this binary of progress and ruin is evident very vividly in the case of the Nam Mo Cascade project in northern Laos. Tied to the larger Belt and Road Initiative, the project arrived with a very powerful imaginary and promotion, one that casts the river as a resource waiting to be harnessed, and by extension, its residents as compliant subjects of a modern future led by technology, science, and infrastructure. Promotional materials such as the one visualized in this slide, called Love to the Namu, are vivid examples of these dominant imaginaries and images, inviting viewers to witness the range of improvements across social and environmental dimensions that supposedly follows large dam projects. But on the riverbanks, everyday life takes place in ways that exceeds and in some ways subverts the script. The new Namu emerges in fragments. A new restaurant that markets the reservoir as this new must-go leisure landscape. Resettled residents speculating on new ways of sustaining their livelihoods, either through farming animals or experimenting with new crops. But also more vulnerable residents navigating loss and actively questioning the abundant future that the dams were supposed to bring. So what drives this chapter are precisely these in-between moments and spaces and these uneven futures emerging. And through these fragments, what I try to achieve in this chapter is a sense of how local communities inhabit the dam river, not as a finished project, but as a shifting terrain of possibility, constraint, as well as aspiration. Seeing the dam Namu in this way illustrates the long-term impacts and implications of hydropower development in the country. But at the same time, and more, I guess, importantly for my interest as well as the book's theme, makes visible the agency and politics of effective people as they rework, reappropriate, and unsettle the new future imposed upon them. Well, I'll move on to the next slide that talks a bit about the methodological aspects of this project. I began this research in early 2020 as a part of a larger program based at the National University of Singapore. And my original plan was grounded in fairly conventional ethnographic practice, meeting key informants, introducing myself to village leaders, spending time with residents, and learning through shared presence. But the COVID-19 pandemic intervened almost immediately after I could formally start my fieldwork, and being present became quite tricky, at least in person, and took on an entirely different meaning for the months and years in the Singaporean context afterwards. Instant messaging replaced our team meetings with my collaborators, and scheduled phone calls stood in for field visits. But working remotely, although reluctantly, made something else visible for me and my larger PhD project. It's that the images and the imaginaries of the dam Namu were circulating just as actively virtually as they were on the ground. So what began as a pandemic workaround, a way to compensate for what has been lost, a mixture of this in-person, remote visual methods, became an approach of its own, and the kind that allowed me to trace how the river's future was being imagined, lived, as well as contested across multiple mediums. I'll end my presentation talk here and leave the remainder for the Q&A session afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumiya. Your patchwork ethnography is a fascinating way of conducting research. Next up is Phill Wilcox, who is a researcher and lecturer at the Faculty of Sociology at Bielefeld University in Germany. Her research draws on long-term interest in development and Laos. Okay, Phill.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for being here. This is a chapter about connecting places here, Laos with China and China with Laos, and what happens when places become much more closer connected physically by the high-speed Laos-China railway. In this chapter, I ask what physical connection in Laos really means, and argue that being connected physically via infrastructure does not necessarily make for a closer connection in other ways. The chapter is about construction of the railway, but it starts well before that. It takes a long view, starting with a journey I made across the Laos-China border via a series of bus connections back in 2002, and well before I ever imagined becoming a researcher. That journey was slow, took several days, and subject to a lot of bemused questions about whether it would actually be possible to cross at all. And then in the chapter, I am tracing trajectories of movement up to and including mobility on the railway as we see here. And my argument is that sure, closer connection is all well and good, but it also entrenches a sense of difference of where one country stops and another starts. It makes a distant border somehow more immediate and more of a tangible reality. And so here, the railway both brings people together, but also entrenches a sense of separation or difference between one place and another. This chapter also looks at how we live with our neighbours and how increasingly close relation does not automatically mean warmer and friendlier in day-to-day life. Drawing inspiration from the rather limited scholarship on neighbouring that exists, I observe here how we can probably all think of a neighbour who is positive in some ways but worries us in others, especially when they start to display what we might regard as unwelcome levels of influence over us, and the chapter looks at that in day-to-day life. Moving to the next slide, what does it actually mean to travel well? I recount how, until the opening of the railway, mobility in Laos was slow and inefficient, and it largely still is in places that the railway cannot reach, which are often typified as somehow underdeveloped. I talk in the chapter about how people interact with these new forms of mobility. What happens when people who've never seen a train encounter one up close as it passes their houses every day, or when they travel on it for the first time? I also talk about how the railway has entrenched a sense of, quote, Chinese ways of doing stuff, end quote, in Laos. As we see here, the station, like all stations on the railway, is a hybrid of Chinese and Laos style, and how in the picture at the top of this slide, a boundary demarcates what a food vendor told me marks the difference between the Chinese railway and the country of Laos before that barrier. In the waiting hall in the picture below, in which I spent many hours waiting for trains, we see a waiting hall devoid of the day-to-day business of life that typically marks Lao bus stations and is more akin to an airport or a more sterile space. This is also a space in which one of the interlocutors who contributed to this chapter told me that he was struck by how Chinese ways of behaving had come to Laos, and how during his time studying in China, he had become quite accustomed to being told what to do as part of customer service, except that here it was, in his words, Chinese people telling Lao people how to behave, only this time in Laos itself. At the same time, many people responded very positively to being able to travel at speed and a good price to do so between places along the railway line. In the conclusion of this chapter, I return to this question of what it means to be close, and how in being close physically, this doesn't necessarily mean close emotionally, regardless of what official rhetoric might say. I suggest that the railway is a great mirror for the Laos-China relationship, particularly in how people interact and engage with it, and crucially, that this ethnographic perspective of traveling along over so many years is really vital for bringing out those dynamics of everyday life and for thinking through social relations by and through infrastructure over several decades. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Phill. The Chinese rail expansion is astounding. But personally, what I found most interesting in your chapter when I worked on it was the Laotian angst and aspirations towards their northern neighbors. Yeah. Our third presenter is Floramante Ponce, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities in Essen. His peer-reviewed publications discuss development-induced displacement, actual and spiritual forms of energy, Chinese infrastructure, and interestingly, the scamming industry in Southeast Asia. Over to you, Floramante.
Good morning. I'll be talking about refrigeration, about relocation. After relocation, what refrigerators can and cannot do to improve lives in a resettled community in northwestern Laos. This chapter focuses on something very ordinary, a refrigerator. But through that everyday object, I explore much bigger issues such as displacement, inequality, modernity, and the limits of development. I want to begin with a moment from my fieldwork. On a very hot afternoon in May 2019, I visited Maya, a woman in her late 40s living in Banmai resettlement, a community created by the Nam Nuo 1 hydropower project. It is a pseudonym. It was so hot that even sitting inside with an electric fan did not help much. So we sat outside and Maya served cold soda from her refrigerator. That cold drink felt refreshing and comforting, but Maya explained that cold drinks were not the main reason why she bought the refrigerator. She told me that if people still had gardens nearby and easy access to the forest, she would not have needed one. For me, that comment captures the central point of the chapter. The refrigerator became important not simply because life improved after relocation, but because relocation made everyday life harder. I focus on three main ideas. First, the paradox of electricity. Hydropower projects in Laos are often presented as symbols of progress and modernization. In this case, the project brought 24-hour electricity to the resettled village, which meant that people could now use refrigerators and other appliances. Before relocation, electricity had been limited and unreliable. But at the same time, the dam project also disrupted access to forest, gardens, and other food sources that villagers had depended on. So there is a real contradiction. The same project that damaged local food systems also introduced electricity, which people then used to cope with those losses. In that sense, refrigerators help people adapt. They made it easier to store leftovers, preserve food, and cool drinks during intense heat. But they did not solve the deeper problems created by the resettlement. Second, the politics of refrigerators. A refrigerator may seem like a neutral household appliance, but I show that it is actually tied to power and inequality. Not every household in Banmai could afford one, even a second-hand one. So simply owning a refrigerator already reflected an economic difference. Even among owners, refrigerators created new social distinctions. In the former villages, serving cold drinks to guests already suggested some degree of affluence. But in the new settlement, that standard changed. Now, being seen as prosperous or modern also meant being able to offer a variety of cold drinks and food stored in a refrigerator. So the refrigerator became more than just a storage device. It became part of how status was displayed and how prosperity was recognized in the resettled community. The third one, modernity is experienced differently. I also challenge the idea that electrification creates one shared experiences of modernity. Some scholarship suggests that when rural communities gain access to electricity, they gain a similar experience of modern life. But what I found was more complicated. Many villagers describe refrigerators as bringing sabay or comfort, but they made the body feel better by providing cold drinks and helping preserve food. But that did not always mean people felt their lives had truly improved overall. Some relatively wealthier villagers link refrigerators and new businesses to both physical comfort and emotional happiness. But many others describe something more ambivalent. They could enjoy the convenience and the feeling of being modern while still living in the poverty, insecurity, and the failures of resettlement. So one of my arguments is this: a refrigerator can bring comfort to the body, but not necessarily happiness to the heart. To conclude, I argue that refrigerators can improve some parts of daily life. They help families adjust to new conditions, store food more effectively, and create moments of comfort. But clearly, they have limits. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Floramante. I found it fascinating how you turned the simple fridge into such a complex object of investigation. Now to our fourth presenter, Elizabeth M. Elliott, who is an independent researcher and honorary research fellow at University College London. A medical anthropologist with a background in Asian traditional medicines, she is currently working in applied public health in the Asia-Pacific region. It's all yours, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Can I move straight to my first slide, please? Next one. Thank you. So the prompt for this talk was to reflect on this question of being present. And here is a photo of somewhere I was literally present. This is the medicine house of one of the traditional healers in the south of Laos in Champasak that I studied with. And I actually spent a period of time sleeping just next door to this. The healer said, well, you like the medicines, you should sleep there too. I think he just didn't know where else to put me. So during this time in my fieldwork, 2015 to 16, I tried hard to position myself as a student. And this was a role which helped explain my presence, but also, as David mentioned earlier, highlighted my inability to learn well, the simple prerequisite to be able to recognize and name the plants in the forest. And I was a constant source of amusement for my muddled brain and even my difficulty in even writing basic prescriptions. But the time I spent with traditional healers, observing them treat patients, collecting plants in the forest, discussing principles of medicine, really helped to highlight what they felt to be important. And one recurring theme was especially how to distinguish an effective and an ethical healer from somebody just selling medicines for profit. So unlike my previous education in traditional Chinese medicine, there's no standardized or institutionalized form of Lao traditional medicine, even within the lowland tradition, which incorporates Buddhist, Ayurvedic, Khmer, possibly Chinese influences into locally practiced forms, which have been transmitted through a predominantly male lineage of apprenticeship. There are similar principles, but each healer has their own methods, recipes, and approaches. But the question of efficacy is one that is important to anyone using medicines, researching, promoting, or even critiquing one. Simply, does it work? And if so, how does it work? There are many criterion debates about the most appropriate way to judge this, including the subjectivity of the person receiving treatment. And for those seeking care, I often spoke to them about their tales of complex and sometimes expensive journeys in the search for good medicines, yadi. And when I asked them if their medicine was good, would often say, well, I don't know yet. I'm waiting to see what the outcome is. But for the Moya, the healers, efficacy was not an abstract concept. So in this chapter, I show that the intended outcome of their treatment guided the whole process of creating prescribing medicines through a clear framework that was both founded on traditional principles, but reinterpreted in modern biomedical terms. The first part of this was the relative potency of the plants. These should be fresh, collected in the wild. You can see some examples in this picture, really wide range of different types of roots, barks, and so on. And while especially considered especially potent in the south. And one of this, you have these prescriptions. So you can see here a photo of a, next slide, please. Can we move to the next slide? Thanks. So you can see here in the photo another healer I studied with, Pornuang, and his collection of notebooks, which represented the collected knowledge of all of his teachers. And within this, you find Damla prescriptions, which are a mixture of things inherited from their teachers, recipes for plant medicines, there could be mantras and so on. And a good healer, he would tell me, was one who had written many prescriptions. And the skill for this is really in the adaptation and the skill in listening closely to the person's needs and diagnosing them. But most importantly, and the focus of this chapter is, if you see on the right-hand side, pitsanu or pisanu, which is considered the medicine's active ingredient. And this was really the explanation of the healers of why their medicine works. And there are various theories about the origin of this term. Some people say it refers to the Hindu deities, Vishnu or Ganesh, or to Kumanalapet, the Buddha's personal physician or a medicine spirit, which really kind of reflects this layered religious history of southern Laos. But basically, it required the healers follow rules of conduct, such as following the 5 Buddhist precepts, especially not lying, crucially not never selling their medicines, only accepting donations, and collecting plants according to astrological principles, which restricted how much of a plant could be taken at a time. And if they broke any of these rules, especially selling medicines, they said it would destroy the pitsanu of the medicine and thus render them unefficacious, as well as affecting the healer himself. And I was constantly warned of the risk of going mad. So if any of you can speak Lao, you can see this, you can see just here the prescription, and it's actually written pisanu, which perhaps is an older spelling. But the healers told me it was pitsanu, and pit means a poison or a toxin, and they considered this to be the active ingredient of the medicine. And they told me this was a substance that could be measured based on the retrospective outcomes. These views perhaps influenced by Marxist science and their real desire to be seen as scientific in a context of low self-state regulation, and most particularly to identify who the correct practitioners are considered to be and the kind of recognition that they yearned for. And finally, it's also worth noticing in our discussions around traditional medicines, a huge issue, of course, is with loss of biodiversity, exploitation, both of plants, but also of patients. And so these rules provided a kind of protection against this. So I'll stop there and hopefully you'll read my chapter and learn the rest. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I found it impressive how you not only drew on surveys and interviews with traditional healers, but actually you also had a hands-on apprenticeship. And finally, our 5th presenter, Giulio Ongaro, is an assistant professor of anthropology at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. His research focuses on ritual healing, ethnopsychiatry, and the placebo effect, drawing on his fieldwork among ethnic Akha in Laos. He is now writing a book on the global history of psychiatry. Over to you, Giulio.
Hi, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Basically, my chapter in the book discusses a new shamanic phenomenon that I documented among the Akha about 10 years ago. And I basically write about how a form of shamanic power that in the Akha past had collective political force recently has morphed into a power of ecstatic healing within the sphere of individual healing performance. And I give some context to this change in the chapter. So to those who don't know the Akha are a highland group in northern Laos and neighboring borderlands. Historically, they belong to what James Scott called Sumiya, so that upland region in Southeast Asia that long remained beyond the full control of lowland states, although there were all kinds of interactions that in a sense also shaped Akha culture and Highlanders cultures and customs. And I did fieldwork there for about 19 months in Luang Nam Ta province, Muang Long district, near the border with Myanmar. Actually, I realized that I came back from fieldwork 10 years ago today, although I went back many times since. So my main focus during my fieldwork was shamanism, the shamanic tradition, healing ritual, and efficacy. So I worked mostly with shamans. And one of the interesting things about traditional Aka shamanism is that it has elements of ecstasy and trance, but it's also highly formalized. So shamans train extensively. They have to learn a huge corpus of oral ritual texts. The healing ritual is very long, it's very costly, it's demanding. So this shamanism is not really done for financial gains, which are very few, but it's really done mostly out of vocation, out of a calling. And what's especially important about traditional ritual efficacy is that it's understood not to depend on personal charisma, but mostly on the correct adherence to ancestral customs. And in fact, when you look at their rituals, I went to so many of them, they take place at night. So there's basically no audience because everyone is asleep. There's no really performance. It's just an interaction between shamans and spirit. It's very rich, it's very symbolically speaking, but there's not really performance or theater in that sense of the word. However, by the end of my fieldwork in 2015, 2016, I also came across the emergence of a new movement of shamans that seem to work in a completely different way, in an opposite way, in a sense. And so in the chapter, I described the activity of two main shamans who are part of this new phenomenon, who were called to the village to perform healing ceremonies, and who, for the time they were there, became the talk of the village. And my informants, my interlocutors, called these individuals apese, which is a term that I never really heard up to that point. But I discovered that although people talked about this new shamans as new, I realized that this term actually was not new at all in Aka history. And Paul Lewis, who was a missionary and an anthropologist who researched the Aka in Burma since the 1940s, defined apese back then as people who, I quote, get the spirit of a mystical messianic type religion, which in practice leads to revolt against the oppressors. And he mentions a few historical cases where these messianic leaders managed to mobilize a huge amount of followers against the lowland Shan and sort of unsuccessfully sort of fight them for a while. So these people are not healers, basically. They were messianic leaders that promised political transformation. They were sort of prophets in a Weberian sense. So the people with the same name, apese, that came to my village had in a way similar characteristics. They were also violently possessed by higher ancestral spirits, at least that's what they said. They had a lot of apprentices and followers. They were very charismatic. They were flamboyantly dressed. They had a different demeanor from ordinary villagers, and they really caught the people's attention from the time they were there. But their power was not political at all. Their power was mostly it was healing power. And what made them quite distinctive and famous was not just about their aura, but also the fact that they subverted a lot of traditional rules that would underpin traditional shamanic healing rituals. For example, and we can go to the next slide, here I make the comparison. You see on the right, it's the new shamans, in the left, the traditional shamans. So the new shaman chanted during the day, not during the night, and that guaranteed them a lot of audience who kind of flocked there to see them. They violated key principles of traditional shamanism. They chanted on the male side of the house, not the female side of the house. They didn't use the traditional knife. These rituals were very dramatic. There was trance, there were ecstatic moments. They vomited, they fainted, there were all kinds of shenanigans. These people also had particular biographies. Importantly, also, they charged a lot of money. It was a lucrative business. It was all about performance. Much to the disapproval of the traditional shamans, who kind of looked at them with skepticism. And having studied traditional shamanism myself, I also looked at them with skepticism myself too. So towards the end of the chapter, I kind of give some context to this transformation, this historical transformation of the apese phenomenon in Aka history. And my conclusion is that this transformation reflects broader historical changes in upland-lowland relations in Laos. And in a post-Zomian context, the Laos state has extended its presence into the highlands and has remained very suspicious of politically insurgent activities at its fringes. The people I live with talked about the state being frightened by some of these apese people. So what was once a messianic collective political force has been redirected into a depoliticized but still powerful form of ecstatic healing. And in adapting to these new conditions, This phenomenon has become more theatrical, more marketable, but also more individualized. And finally, to just come back to the theme of the book, being present, I argue that in a way, being present in the village on its own is not quite enough to get the full picture of the phenomenon, because you might be inclined to see state action just as an authoritarian attack on indigenous practice and belief. But this would really miss the wider context, because Laos is a self-defined socialist state that was born out of a struggle against imperialism and striving for national unity. And from that perspective, the suspicion towards these upper figures would be very understandable. In fact, these upper shamans still possess all the attributes that could turn them into powerful, politically powerful authorities. Charisma, trickery, the persuasive aura, the claims of extraordinary powers. So from this perspective, it's kind of clear, it's kind of obvious why the Lao government wanted to neutralize the political potential of these shamans and to smother shamanic activity that is perceived to go beyond individual healing. And so this is basically what this historical transformation is what I discuss in the chapter. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Giulio. The thought of a convergence between new shamanism and market Leninism is quite astounding. But now let's move on to the Q&A and get all our presenters up on stage. Okay. There are some questions, a lot of comments, some questions. Feel free to add more, and the little time we've got left, we'll see how much time we have to answer them. As you see, the refrigerator really has sparked something there. You can see that comment. I have a question there, Floramante. I was fascinated by the vividly coloured fridges in your study. Being used to plain, ordinary, white fridges here in Europe, I was curious if people in Laos are decorating their fridges, or are they actually buying fridges that are manufactured in this vivid color?
Okay, so can I answer another question?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, I think it depends, on the types of the refrigerator. Those refrigerators in the stores, outside their houses, they do not decorate it. I mean, the color, they don't have a choice also. These are, how do you call it? These are, they already had color before they purchased it,
Okay, so they were colored, yeah.
Yeah, but I think in terms of decorating them, like for instance, here in Germany, for instance, they put some magnets, right? In order to somehow like personalize the doors of the refrigerators. Some of them, they did that because it also like symbolizes status, that they travel to China or to Thailand or to Vietnam, for instance. So they put some households, but not everyone, Yeah, the commercial refrigerators did not do anything to it because the doors of those commercial refrigerators they have transparent doors.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'm curious, are there any ways that your being present in your field work has changed anything about how you've been present since your field work has concluded, whether research related or not? A bit of feedback from each of you there, maybe.
Yeah, I can start with this. I can respond to this question first and let others think through. I think having to cope with the pandemic as a first-time researcher to Laos and someone who was so eager to conduct proper ethnographic research, right? And then not being able to do that, I think the heartbreak of that still lingers, to be honest. But I think the other side of that experience was one in where I now can see fieldwork or data in a lot of other things than before. So for example, my recent work with the Powerhouse Museum in Australia was looking at the visual dimensions or visualities of large dams across New South Wales and how the visuals of dams itself in promotional videos or documentary photography can tell us something about the kinds of aesthetic preferences that would have developed or preferences over what kinds of social activities can happen around, for example, reservoirs, right? So it did help me move my research in into different directions and think of fieldwork not only in an in-person being there way. So in that sense, I think it really helped expand my toolbox as an ethnographer or a social researcher and a geographer more generally. But at the same time, I think because I'm still publishing and engaging with the PhD research and the materials that I have gathered from 2020 until 2022 in my publications up till now, I'm still very much present in the past, if that makes sense, and present in the NAMU and the interviews that I've collected there with my collaborators. So it's an interesting translocal experience in that sense, through time as well as place.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. We have, let's be blunt, we are nearly up with our hour. If there's anybody want to add any more feedback here right now, otherwise let's wrap the session. Okay, folks, our time is up. Rosalie, David,
Yes.
Phill, Floramante, Elizabeth, Guido, Sumiya, thank you very much for talking about the book. I hope it has been as pleasant for you as it has been interesting for us watching your presentations. And since you're here up on stage, let me ask you to show the book. Yeah. Okay, thank you. As for all of you out there who have joined us today, some of you posing questions, many posing comments, also those joining the recorded video later, thank you very much for taking part. We hope you found this an interesting and informative presentation. Before you go, I should tell you that we are offering a special 20% discount if you should like to buy Being Present. This offer is for 2 weeks only, and all the details are on the screen in front of you. Scan the QR code or go to the NUS Press website and use the discount code BEING20 to get the special price. Thank you and goodbye.